A child disappears under seemingly ordinary circumstances, and in a short time, the incident becomes a global tragedy. As numerous resources are mobilized, a suspect is gradually identified, and information begins to be shaped according to a certain narrative. The question arises, what truly happened behind the disappearance? And who is secretly manipulating the public's perception of this story?
Why have there been innumerable policing hours spent and budgets going into the dozens of millions? It's a nonsense. It's a nonsense. It's the Met Police, and why is the Met Police dealing with it? Surely this is Leicestershire Police, not Leicestershire. Surely this is Leicestershire's inquiry. It isn't even Leicestershire's inquiry. It's the police of the judicial police in Portugal. It's their jurisdiction, it's their inquiry, and they concluded early on, that there's nothing to see, and that the McCann should be held culpable. They've clearly stated it, and I totally concur with that. I think that's the truth.
One can choose to feel compassion for those who go missing, or to question why they disappeared, and only the second approach offers any real possibility of moving closer to the truth. 17 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared in Praia da Luz, Algarve, Portugal, the debate over who is responsible for her departure continues on a global scale. Yet what stands out is not only the incident itself, but the way public interest has gradually become a veil that makes the system's shortcomings less visible. In many similar cases, victims slowly fade from collective memory as investigative mechanisms, media operations, and related institutions prioritize their own preservation. And at times the individuals suspected of causing the tragedy unintentionally become the central figures of the public narrative. This case, therefore, is not only about questioning the innocence or involvement of any individual. It also reflects how a larger machinery operates through both society's empathy and curiosity, creating a structure capable of sustaining attention and controversy for an extended period of time. Madeleine McCann was a child living inside a system built by adults, where the line between entertainment and genuine concern became blurred, and where responsibility was sometimes replaced by avoidance. The images of her in a pink dress, her small smile, and the sunlight of that vacation in Praia da Luz, Algarve, Portugal gradually turned into symbols of innocence frozen in time. Yet once an image is elevated into a symbol, it can lead the public to feel more than they think, allowing sorrow to exist without prompting any meaningful change. Madeleine's case clearly reflects a hierarchy of vulnerability in which faces that fit media preferences, such as white, middle-class children, are often prioritized on front pages and in public memorials, while children from poorer neighborhoods, refugee children, or other missing cases receive far less attention, sometimes never being mentioned at all in news coverage. Within that system, children become the most vulnerable group yet, are simultaneously transformed into a kind of symbolic value used in politics, media, and charity as moral illustrations. Many headlines express concern, but concern without accountability becomes nothing more than a public stage. The story of Madeleine McCann turned into the centerpiece of fundraising campaigns, sponsorship agreements, and documentary productions. Across many other cases, the same pattern repeats. A child is only noticed after a tragedy occurs, and that attention becomes a form of emotional safety for the public, allowing people to share posts, light candles, spread hashtags, and then quickly move on to a new cycle of concern. Beneath that emotional surface remains an unchanging reality. A child was left alone, and only when the situation became socially inconvenient did the story rise to the center of public debate. In an investigation from years earlier, records showed that a young boy had been placed under the system's intervention 3 times. Each time his story appeared in the media, he received letters, toys, and even fundraising campaigns created in his name. But the moment the cameras left, he returned to a care environment already burdened with serious problems. His image was cherished on television, yet forgotten within administrative procedures. This is a clear illustration of how compassion, when commercialized, can become a consumer product. The case of Madeleine McCann is not an exception, but simply a more amplified example. Her disappearance reveals not only the fragility of a child, but also reflects a society built on selective empathy. The public often decides which victims deserve attention. The media dictates when sympathy should be expressed and when it should fade, and governing bodies sometimes use the image of children to push policy or reinforce credibility. This creates a form of social value extracted from suffering. The hierarchy of vulnerability shows that priority often leans toward victims who fit media templates, while many others receive little attention, including children living in difficult circumstances in cities like Birmingham or Bucharest. Heart-tugging posters generate more response than thousands of unnoticed case files. A previous case recorded that a girl the same age as Madeleine was found to have passed away in an apartment without attracting media interest, without memorials, and without any public promises of justice. Her file appeared on an investigator's desk, marked simply as a non-suspicious passing. This case reflects the reality of victims overlooked because they do not fit the public narrative. A system designed to protect instead functions as a machine for sorting, assessing lives based on their ability to generate public attention. When a story like that of Madeleine McCann draws widespread attention, numerous agencies and organizations respond immediately. Media groups prepare statements, charities launch calls for support, and journalists quickly publish analyses about the landscape of modern parenting. Meanwhile, crucial tasks such as risk prevention, strengthening child protection, and improving procedural systems are often pushed aside. This phenomenon is not unique to Madeleine's case. It has been observed in many similar situations where symbolic memorials or public gatherings are prioritized, while the core measures needed to prevent future serious incidents receive far less focus. As public interest intensifies, that attention often generates benefits for related organizations or individuals through credibility, reach, or political prestige. Yet it simultaneously makes the victim more likely to be viewed as a representative image rather than a real person. In many instances, the public react strongly because the story provides recognizable elements, someone to criticize, a figure to analyze, or a mystery to follow, turning the event into a widely consumed form of content. This is how empathy operates in modern society. It can be organized, distributed, and leveraged like a product, rather than becoming a driving force for meaningful actions that protect children or improve the system. When the case file of Madeleine McCann was widely released, the public reaction was immediate, global, and deeply emotional. Yet the energy that could have driven meaningful changes in child protection policy was instead redirected into rumors, speculation, and controversy, turning the case into a media stage rather than a systemic warning. In many situations where children experience serious incidents, their expressions of wonder and trust appear much like the images seen in this case. But very few of those situations ever appear in the news or are mentioned in community campaigns. Each time Madeleine's image circulates, it simultaneously evokes the faces of countless other children who never receive similar attention. There is a striking contrast here. The disappearance of a child can easily become a symbol of societal neglect, and that symbol gives the public a sense that their compassion remains intact. Yet invoking a victim's name without motivating any real change in child protection systems reveals a more concerning truth. The tragedy lies not only in a child's disappearance, but also in how the event becomes evidence of a persistent lack of meaningful action and a stagnation of responsibility within the community, where core problems remain unaddressed despite widespread public concern. When discussing the case of Madeleine McCann, many observations arise not from journalism or activism, but from the reality that spaces once filled with children's laughter can quickly become evidence of the system's lack of effectiveness. Systems do not fail randomly. They fail because allowing shortcomings is often less costly than maintaining comprehensive protective measures. The hierarchy of vulnerability shows that some lives are treated as more important than others, at least in the way media and public opinion respond. Until this reality changes, missing child cases will continue to be repurposed as media narratives rather than catalysts for necessary reform. This raises an important question. In situations like these, who is the true victim? Is it the child who disappeared? Or is it the public's perception, maintained in a way that appears compassionate, but is not accompanied by concrete action? When a child goes missing, public concern often erupts instantly. Media outlets operate non-stop. Charities emerge with calls for support, and teams of reporters quickly assemble to cover the story. In a short time, an incident that should center on investigation and child protection can shift into a commercially driven operation. The case of Madeleine McCann illustrates this clearly. After she disappeared in Praia da Luz, her image no longer functioned solely as an identification photo for investigative purposes, but gradually became a widely recognized symbol across continents. Madeleine's name and picture appeared on bracelets, banners, souvenirs, and various media forms. Campaigns and broadcasts repeated her story regularly, and each appearance generated certain benefits for connected organizations or entities. Observations from similar incidents show that in the early days of a missing child case, public attention often stems from genuine goodwill. However, as funding, visibility, and influence grow, the original nature of the situation can become distorted, and the suffering of the victim and family may fade behind external interests. This cycle has occurred in many other cases, where the purity of supportive intentions is gradually replaced by incentives created through sustained public attention. The tragedy of Madeleine McCann gradually transformed into a marketplace driven by public emotion. Television network produced special programs. Newspapers featured appeals on their front pages, and numerous online platforms competed for exclusive updates. New leads, witness statements, or reports of sightings in distant places like Morocco quickly became headlines built not to support the search effort, but primarily to maintain engagement. Each broadcast, crafted to heighten emotion, helped extend the story's lifespan, and every segment filled with empathy kept the public invested both emotionally and economically. Some media experts refer to this phenomenon as constructed empathy, where emotion becomes a tool of the content industry. Throughout this process, producers learned exactly when audiences began to lose interest, studied which visual details could hold viewers longer, and adjusted music or memorial scenes to convey gravity and increase communication impact. Even charities adopted a similar rhythm when a missing child case became an ideal symbol for fundraising campaigns due to its universality and lack of controversy. Campaigns with messages like "Find Madeleine" or "Never Give Up Hope" emerged with short, memorable slogans. Within months, multiple support funds had been created, drawing contributions from around the world. Corporations sponsored posters and printed materials. Celebrities helped spread information, and politicians wore symbolic tributes on their clothing. In this progression, the original pain of the incident gradually took on the shape of a widely recognized brand. In many meetings held years after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the case was often referenced as a benchmark for public engagement, a reflection of how the crisis management industry measures effectiveness through the emotional reach of a story. Madeleine became a case study in the ability to mobilize global attention, with consultants analyzing the campaign's reach and marketing firms discussing its sustained value. Over time, the story shifted away from that of a missing child and transformed into a media product in which every emotional reaction from the public could be converted into measurable indicators: views, engagement levels, or advertising revenue. Images from memorials, from flickering candles to trembling hands or stifled sobs, regularly appeared in edited broadcasts designed to create a sense of deep connection. These moments were constructed as a kind of visual symbol, making viewers feel as though they were participating in an act of moral significance. However, such participation often reflects how emotions are directed by media, creating the impression of action without producing meaningful change. Genuine empathy requires patience, quiet reflection, and the willingness to confront difficult issues. Whereas media-generated empathy tends to be superficial, easily spread, commercially adaptable, and far less effective in addressing the root causes of the incident. When millions of people share a hashtag connected to a case, few stop to ask why the system failed in the earliest stages. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann should have sparked intense scrutiny of shortcomings in child protection, accountability, and the need for reform. But instead, the story was pulled into a cycle of emotion marked by sensational updates and publicly performed displays of empathy. Each passing year brings new documentaries, memorial programs, podcasts, and previously unreleased footage, material that serves the public's constant demand for novelty rather than any genuine search for solutions. This phenomenon does not stem from any single individual, but from a collective mechanism in which the public seeks sorrow to connect with. The media seeks compelling content, and governing bodies leverage the image of innocent victims to obscure institutional shortcomings. The tragedy fits neatly into this structure. Meanwhile, many other families who have endured loss receive no media attention at all, enduring their pain in silence, without campaigns, without official statements, without any intervention from communication teams. But when a case becomes a global focal point, the family's grief shifts from a personal experience to a kind of public performance, placing parents at the center of a narrative they cannot control. Public expectations turn every reaction into something open to interpretation. Too little emotion appears cold, too much seems theatrical. This is the consequence of grief becoming part of the media landscape, where the presence of cameras makes genuine emotional expression nearly impossible to perceive naturally. For many years after Madeleine McCann disappeared, her story continued to be reused across countless forms of media. Content like "The Mystery of Madeleine," "The Truth About the Algarve," or "Never-Before-Seen Evidence" was promoted with promises of new discoveries. Yet most simply recycled familiar images, old quotes, and memorial rituals that had long become formulaic. These productions attracted attention, but rarely pushed the public to think more deeply about the nature of the case. This raises a question about ownership of the pain. Does it still belong to the family? Or has it become a kind of shared commodity, edited, licensed, and distributed as part of the content market? The existence of two parallel worlds becomes unmistakable. One world acknowledging the disappearance of a child, and another in which that absence continues to stain an industry built on public emotion. In this context, mentioning Madeleine's name is not always an act of remembrance. At times, it serves the needs of media platforms, charity projects, or public campaigns. Her story gradually became the center of a network involving media outlets, nonprofit organizations, and public relations teams, all operating through the continual reproduction of different versions of the same tragedy. Even after many years, new podcasts, true crime programs, and dramatized films continue to use Madeleine's image because the market consistently demands such narratives. In this landscape, it becomes clear that Madeleine is a victim in two senses. First, through her original disappearance, and second, through the repeated use of her story as a tool to sustain attention, creating the illusion of concern without being tied to any substantive change. Society often believes that empathy reflects our humanity, but when empathy is operated as a component of the media industry, it can become a directed and manipulative tool. In this context, the image of Madeleine McCann appears both as a missing child and as a widely used symbol, carrying innocence while simultaneously being leveraged as a shield that allows various institutions to avoid accountability. As her face continues to be used like a brand in media campaigns and related products, the concept of justice risks being reduced to a slogan rather than a genuine goal pursued through investigation and systemic reform. In many cases that attract major public attention, there often comes a moment when society begins demanding the identification of a villain. That expectation gravitates toward a name, a face, and sometimes an image that can easily be interpreted in a negative light. The public usually seeks a clear conclusion rather than accepting the complexity of an ongoing investigation. When factual evidence cannot yet provide definitive answers, the system may at times construct a substitute figure to satisfy the need for social reassurance. This is when an investigation risks shifting its focus from evidence-based work to maintaining public confidence. In many instances, the case remains unresolved, public frustration intensifies, authorities face mounting pressure, and the media starts steering the narrative toward finding someone to hold responsible. At that point, the investigative process can be influenced by the demand for a designated figure to ease societal tension. In 2020, 13 years after Madeleine McCann disappeared in Praia da Luz, a new suspect was presented to the public: Christian Bruckner. His image quickly flooded headlines, from arrest photos to frames that easily encouraged viewers to associate him with the figure of someone posing danger. German authorities described Bruckner as an individual with threatening behavior, and within hours the case once again became a global focal point. Debates and emotions that had quieted over the years surged back, fueling expectations that the mystery had reached its turning point. However, when the dramatic elements are stripped away, the remaining information centers on a man with a criminal record who had been in the Algarve and had a history involving improper activities. These details were enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to create investigative certainty. Bruckner had lived near the resort area in Portugal and had connections to the use of harmful substances, theft, and other illicit conduct within European criminal circles. He owned an old yellow Volkswagen van, and several witnesses reported having seen the vehicle in the area. For the public, these fragments were sufficient to complete their own narrative. A man with a complicated past, a means of transport, and prior presence near a location tied to the case. From an emotional standpoint, this structure fit the familiar pattern of a compelling story. Limitations in the timeline, or the absence of physical evidence directly linking Bruckner to the apartment, became faint details, overshadowed by the power of a convenient narrative. A familiar dynamic in high-profile cases is that when pressure intensifies, factors outside actual evidence can easily be amplified, helping shape a figure who fills the void left by uncertainty. At that point, investigative needs for a clear conclusion and the public's desire for reassurance converge at a single point. Finding a recognizable face, someone with a controversial past, and placing that person at the center of an unresolved story. In such a context, there is no requirement for definitive proof of responsibility. It is enough that the public believes it could be true for the story to retain its influence. Christian Bruckner became an ideal choice for a suspect selection strategy in a context where the public was searching for someone to hold responsible. He was German, had lived a transient life, and carried a criminal history involving serious wrongdoing, details that carried far more emotional weight than any forensic report could offer. These traits fit so seamlessly that the media needed little adjustment. They simply rearranged existing information to construct the image of a dangerous figure. Many headlines described Bruckner with phrases such as the loner, the drifter, or the predator, accompanied by the least sympathetic photos available. Tired eyes, tense expressions, and dimly lit portraits. These visuals were not reflections of pure journalism, but deliberate compositions meant to evoke a strong reaction. In many cases, this tactic appears as an intentional arrangement, through angle selection, color usage, and framing, to elicit negative associations. A slight shift in portrayal can easily turn a person with a complicated past into the embodiment of wrongdoing. This method proves effective because it offers the public temporary reassurance. Once a face is tied to a negative image, a sense of moral order is restored in the collective mind. With a specific individual identified, the story becomes easier to digest. The harmful act has a face, and crucially, it is not the face of society at large. When the available data were systematically compared, the case constructed around Christian Bruckner quickly revealed major weaknesses. No biological traces, no independent sightings, and no witnesses placing him inside the McCann apartment at the critical moment. The information released by German prosecutors was largely speculative, built on a chain of coincidences rather than verifiable evidence. Yet their official statements were circulated widely with the assertion that Madeleine McCann had passed and that Christian Bruckner was responsible. There was no body, no direct physical evidence, and yet the language conveyed absolute certainty, reflecting a process of shaping public perception more than a purely investigative progression. The media adopted these statements as if they were near-final conclusions, repeating familiar images, constructing timelines optimized for headlines, and citing anonymous sources within German authorities. This created an information landscape filled with a mixture of unease, expectation, and public fatigue. In such a setting, the desire for closure seemed to overshadow the need for verification, making Christian Bruckner a convenient focal point that allowed the public to momentarily regard the case as having a direction. The mechanism of suspect substitution operated by transferring uncertainty onto a single figure. This restored a sense of order, but at the same time, it allowed the pursuit of truth to become something that could be delayed. or diminished. I have witnessed this pattern repeat many times. In the early 2000s, a case in London involved a teenager who was found with no signs of life. The first person suspected was someone who fit all the elements that typically draw public attention: poverty, a tendency toward conflict, and foreign nationality. Tabloid media quickly circulated this individual's identity, while only a few months later it became clear that the person actually responsible had political connections and was handled quietly. The case closed. The wrongly accused person carried the stigma, and the system continued operating as before. This pattern shows that when questions of responsibility approach the sphere of power, that power often restructures the narrative by producing a substitute figure. In the case of Madeleine McCann, the emergence of Christian Bruckner as a publicly announced suspect occurred just as Operation Grange in the UK faced the risk of budget cuts. Public attention was fading. Renewed questions about the family were beginning to surface, and Portuguese authorities had grown weary of the case's political dimensions. At that moment, the statement from Germany introduced a new interpretive path, reshaping the flow of information into a safer trajectory. The UK government could redirect public scrutiny, German authorities could report progress, and Portuguese investigators could ease the pressure they had been under. The result was that multiple parties gained their own advantages, while the truth continued to be delayed within an ongoing process of redefining responsibility and managing public expectations. When reviewing the materials released by prosecutors, what was presented as evidence consisted largely of vague witness statements, a claim from a low-credibility inmate, and a generalized behavioral profile. None of these elements demonstrated that Christian Bruckner was anywhere near Madeleine McCann on the night she disappeared. Yet the objective at that point no longer seemed to be strengthening the truth, but rather showing that the investigation was still active, aimed at easing the emotional pressure of public expectation. This is how the substitute suspect mechanism operates. Once a person is selected as the focal point of blame, the pursuit of the case's true nature risks being overshadowed. In such circumstances, many in the public struggle to accept renewed questioning. Once a villainous image is established, any skepticism toward the prevailing narrative can be misinterpreted as denial or alignment with wrongdoing. Media language relies on phrases such as likely suspect, reliable source, or official confirmation, terms that carry no concrete legal weight but create the impression that the case has moved closer to resolution. This turns Christian Bruckner into a symbolic resting point for public perception, even though the factual record does not substantiate such a conclusion. In reality, justice requires adherence to evidence, even when the evidence leads to directions that are inconvenient in the public sphere. A person may have committed wrong acts in the past, but that does not mean they are automatically connected to every suspected incident. When this distinction is ignored, convenience replaces accuracy, and investigations risk devolving into performance. In such a climate, some believe that identifying a name is equivalent to solving the case, when what they truly seek is temporary reassurance. This is the danger of the substitute suspect mechanism. It satisfies crowd expectations while reducing the likelihood of reaching the truth. And ultimately, the system continues to function by producing a figure to absorb public tension whenever the truth becomes complex or uncomfortable to acknowledge. Every investigation begins with the promise that its goal is to uncover the truth. Yet, as events progress, that promise can slowly transform into a form of performance. In the case of Madeleine McCann, the central issue is not only the disappearance of a child, but what unfolded afterward. where the process of pursuing justice was quietly and systematically reshaped. When people think of serious cases, they often imagine acts of violence or clear physical traces. But there exists another form of harm, slower, more discreet, and institutional in nature: the distortion of truth. This phenomenon takes place in internal meetings, press briefings, public statements, and even parliamentary hearings, where the consequence is not a physical body, but a prolonged state of ambiguity. The Madeleine McCann case became an example of institutional misinformation, as it gradually shifted away from the jurisdiction of investigative authorities and turned into a matter negotiated among those in power. The three involved nations, Germany, the UK, and Portugal, each built its own version of the truth based on diplomatic priorities, national image, and the need for self-protection. In this process, the event itself became a bargaining tool, and authority became a barrier to decisions that required transparency. This is the context that gave rise to what I call the system of three walls, a structure that makes access to the truth increasingly difficult when too many interests become attached to the narrative. The legal wall is the first layer of obstruction. After 2007, the Madeleine McCann case became fragmented along national borders. Portugal's Polícia Judiciária, PJ, retained the original authority. Then the UK's Metropolitan Police launched Operation Grange with the expectation of introducing a new investigative approach. By 2020, German authorities announced the existence of new evidentiary leads along with a primary suspect. Three nations carried out three separate investigations, yet no unified coordination existed. On paper, this appeared to be an international cooperative effort. In reality, it reflected a form of territorially controlled information. Each agency guarded its files as if they were classified material. Requests for document exchange were delayed or denied, and mutual legal assistance treaties became barriers rather than instruments of cooperation. German officials argued that they could not share information due to ongoing legal proceedings. UK authorities cited data protection laws, and Portuguese officials attributed the difficulties to external interference. In this environment, substantive information remained trapped within procedural frameworks. One officer in Lisbon once described how every request from London had to be translated twice, once linguistically, and once to determine intent. This illustrates that the agencies involved were not seeking a comprehensive answer, but were prioritizing the protection of their own jurisdictions. The legal wall thus operates as a bureaucratic layer concealed beneath the appearance of procedure, blocking access to the truth through paperwork, signatures, and rigid territorial safeguards. The second wall is the media. From the very beginning, the story of Madeleine McCann moved beyond the scope of the investigative authorities and quickly became material managed by television networks, tabloid newspapers, and media outlets. Every development was edited, interpreted, and reformatted to fit the emotional rhythm of the news cycle, where information is distributed according to a familiar pattern: hope at the start of the week, outrage by the weekend, and reflection on Sunday. When Germany announced a new development in 2020, the media replicated the same model. Headlines did not focus on whether Christian Bruckner was truly connected to the case, but instead on when a trial might take place, creating the impression that the story was moving toward a conclusion. The template repeated itself: a solitary figure portrayed as dangerous, a child facing a tragedy, and authorities persistently pursuing the case. The speculative nature of the sources or the fragmented investigations across three countries did nothing to change the media formula. because that formula attracted audiences more effectively than sticking to the facts. Behind the cameras existed a mutually dependent relationship between certain media outlets and law enforcement agencies. Investigators needed public attention to justify continued funding, and the media needed exclusive information to drive viewership. In this process, information was sometimes leaked deliberately to draw attention, and some reporters placed access above careful consideration. This was often justified as serving the public interest, though in reality it catered to the audience's demand for engagement. The media wall operates by replacing the investigative process with a pre-structured narrative, giving the public what is easiest to embrace rather than what they need to understand. Once the story reached a global scale, it no longer reflected reality, but became an emotionally engineered product for the information market. The third wall, and the most difficult one to recognize, is the moral wall, a structure not created by governments or the media, but formed through society's collective reaction. This is an invisible barrier rooted in the fear of being criticized, misunderstood, or labeled as insensitive. In the Madeleine McCann case, this wall emerged when some suggested that the family, whether unintentionally or through negligence, might have contributed to the circumstances that led to their daughter's disappearance. The first person to publicly raise this possibility was a Portuguese investigator, and he immediately faced intense backlash, received negative labeling, saw his book restricted, and experienced significant damage to his career. This strong reaction did not arise because evidence had disproven his hypothesis, but because the public did not want to confront a deeply uncomfortable possibility. This is how a form of moral defense is disguised as compassion. People believe they are protecting the innocent, but in reality, they are protecting their own sense of emotional safety. This tendency makes society more willing to assign responsibility to a distant stranger than to consider the role of those closest to the victim, and more comfortable preserving a familiar narrative than examining a complex possibility. The result is stagnation in the pursuit of truth. Investigators limit the scope of their questions. Journalists modify their language, and the public remains silent. In cases involving children across many contexts, this moral wall has upheld silence for years. As teachers, social workers, and individuals in positions of authority believed that avoiding the issue was the right thing to do. They called it caution, but in reality, it was hesitation that allowed essential information to be concealed. The Madeleine McCann investigation is not only about the disappearance of a child, but has gradually become a mirror reflecting how the modern world handles responsibility. Each nation, each agency, and each involved group has created its own version of the story to lessen the share of responsibility placed upon them. Germany directed attention outward. The UK emphasized limitations caused by Portugal, while Portugal argued that the problem stemmed from outside interference. The public, meanwhile, mostly received information through television and believed that following the story was equivalent to genuine concern. This represents a form of collective avoidance, not through any organized conspiracy, but through convenience, as each person simply did slightly less than they could and avoided asking difficult questions. The result is a justice process that becomes performative, empathy replaced by information paralysis, and truth reduced to a seldom addressed topic. In conversations with younger investigators, I often emphasize that the core issue is not the initial event, but what happens afterward, when individuals in positions of authority prioritize protecting their standing rather than uncovering the truth. One memory I carry is standing outside the police headquarters in Lisbon on an evening when the silence seemed to perfectly reflect the stagnation in the search for answers in the case. That building, like many other institutions, shows that no child is ever fully protected from the risk of being turned into a symbol used to reassure society. Ultimately, the pursuit of justice is weakened not only by obvious signs of corruption, but also by the hesitation of those who fear criticism. The truth does not disappear inside an interrogation room. It is obscured by prolonged silence. And silence, as I have come to understand, is never a neutral state. It is a choice. Therefore, when examining what caused the justice process in this case to stall, responsibility cannot be placed on a single individual. The issue lies in a system that surrounded the key information and chose to avoid confronting it. In this context, the most concerning factor is not an explicit conspiracy or a lack of competence, but the collective hesitation that prevents vital questions from being asked and allows the truth to be delayed. In every tragedy, there comes a moment when private grief no longer belongs solely to the family, but begins operating according to the language of the camera, a language often used to shape a narrative. In the case of Madeleine McCann, that moment arrived very early. Within just a few days, the family's loss had become a public event, and their images gradually appeared as familiar characters in a story followed around the world. As with any televised narrative, the progression of the story was shaped by the need for structure, interpretation, and public engagement. This is not a judgment, but an acknowledgement of reality. Because in the realm of child protection, the line between natural reactions and reactions shaped by media influence is always distinct. Genuine grief does not follow a script. It is fragmented, quiet, and unpredictable. Unlike the way it is often presented in the media to meet audience expectations, real grief does not function like a script repeated for press conferences. Yet, through the process of media shaping, it tends to be reformatted through production, editing, and broadcast timing. In the case of Madeleine McCann, the family gradually became an image attached to the branding of sorrow, and that required consistency in communication. Press advisors offered recommendations on tone, posture, the timing of statements, interview content, and even lighting conditions. Detailed guidance on when to speak, when to remain silent, what clothing colors were appropriate, or which images should be released became part of managing the flow of information. What began as an effort to find a missing child shifted into a system designed to steer public perception. Audience reactions also split into two clear directions. One group expressed empathy by sending letters, offering financial support, and sharing images, while another group approached the story with skepticism, creating two opposing responses to the same sequence of events. The public followed the case by scrutinizing the parents' behavior, analyzing every moment they appeared in front of the media, and interpreting each sign in whatever direction they preferred. In that process, everyone assumed a certain role. We click, we leave comments, and we form opinion groups in which some express sympathy, while others maintain skepticism. Neither extreme provides any answers. As long as the story continues to attract attention, the industry built on public emotion continues to have material to sustain itself. This is why the Madeleine McCann case is no longer only about the child herself, but has become a mirror reflecting how society seeks comfort through tragedy. The media shapes loss into a repeated ritual, and viewers continue to participate out of habit, sometimes mistaking the act of following the story for genuine purpose. The story of a missing child gradually transforms into an emotional stage that requires neither a final conclusion nor a specific resolution, but simply the continued extension of attention. This very phenomenon reveals a troubling issue in the way tragedy is received and consumed within the public sphere. In the progression of this tragedy, even the private space of the family gradually became part of the story presented to the public. This is often described as shaping perception, but perception without action leads only to self-satisfaction. When the Madeleine McCann case once again drew attention through the narrative surrounding Christian Bruckner, a clear transfer of moral responsibility to the media took place. Headlines identified the person to be condemned, and the public followed. Journalists who once defended the McCann family shifted to criticizing Bruckner with dramatic language, without requiring concrete evidence. The narrative was prioritized over the truth because it offered quick and easily accepted emotion. Asking questions requires courage and carries the risk of isolation, causing many to avoid doing so. In previous cases I have examined, including networks of ethical violations against children, institutional cover-ups, and incidents involving influential individuals, there were always people who noticed irregularities but chose silence because it felt safer. They believed someone else would speak up, and that hesitation allowed problems to persist. The public often thinks they have no influence, but in reality their attention and reactions form a significant source of power. Each time sensationalism is favored over substantive content, they unintentionally reinforce a system that does not serve their interests. In this context, I once spoke with an investigator involved in the Madeleine McCann case and came to understand how society's silence profoundly shaped the way the story was constructed. In a conversation, an investigator told me that, in many cases, the victim gradually becomes secondary once the story is overtaken by the public's emotional demands. The Madeleine McCann case should have served as a warning about how the system can fail even families with resources, showing that negligence and the influence of the media can coexist. Instead, it became another extension in a chain of tragedies continually followed by the public. At times, the question becomes what would emerge if the perspective were reversed, if the focus were not on suspects or parents, but on the public itself. The result might reveal the reality that many people trade empathy for entertainment, as large numbers of clicks help sustain a system that operates on someone else's suffering. In that context, watching, sharing, or expressing outrage is often seen as action. Yet these things do not automatically lead to justice. Justice requires confronting the limitations of the system and of the community that has unintentionally allowed such stories to repeat. There are cases in which public pressure helps uncover the truth, but there are also cases in which that pressure creates noise, generates rumors, spreads misinformation, and diverts the investigative process. When an event is driven by the demand for engagement, real evidence can be obscured, and society easily confuses surface-level participation with genuine purpose. If there is no change in the way the public approaches cases like this, the familiar reactions will continue to repeat. The frenzy of public opinion, the direction set by the media, and the prioritization of emotion over data, society will keep mourning, debating, and speculating, then move on to the next concern, while somewhere another child may disappear into the silence we create. Observing this over many years, what becomes clear is that unless the public adjusts its expectations and actively demands transparency rather than merely consuming headlines, future cases will follow the same pattern, different names and faces, but the same structure and the same outcome. This shows that the way society receives information directly shapes how these stories are told, understood, and resolved. In every law enforcement agency, There exists an invisible boundary that investigators understand they should not cross, a boundary tied to hierarchy and institutional reputation. When an officer asks questions beyond what is expected, they often face the consequences alone. In the Madeleine McCann case, this became clear within the investigative teams in Portugal and Germany, who began their work by following the evidence but later encountered obstacles when their questions no longer aligned with the official direction. One investigator from Portugal's Justice Police shared that from the moment they raised questions considered off focus, the case was no longer within their control. As a result, some officers were reassigned, some were demoted, and others chose early retirement, all because they continued searching for answers in an environment that did not encourage it. I have witnessed situations in which the pursuit of evidence met interference from higher ranks, when cases were stalled because they involved influential individuals. When I refused to stop, the system's response was isolation, questioning my stability, and circulating information meant to undermine me. This is the familiar pattern: separate, discredit, and remove the person who raises questions, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient. So when I saw investigators in Portugal being restricted after asking questions that did not align with the organization's direction, I understood exactly what they were facing. Becoming the one who speaks up is never a deliberate choice. It is the consequence of personal awareness coming into conflict with institutional compromise. In law enforcement environments, this carries risk because the system often prioritizes protecting its image before protecting the truth. Corruption in this context is not necessarily tied to material gain, but is manifested through a culture of silence, where fear maintains compliance and prevents many leads from being pursued. In many agencies, when information cannot be blurred, the system often shifts to undermining the credibility of the person who presents it, a familiar tactic used to protect internal structure. Even so, there are always individuals who continue pursuing the truth, despite facing professional and personal risks. What drives them may be responsibility, persistence, or a belief in their ethical duty. Many officers I have met remain troubled not by what they did, but by what they were forced to ignore. One person once shared that although on the surface they were simply following orders, they understood clearly how fear had guided their actions. This is the quiet form of pressure within law enforcement environments, where those who speak up are not seeking attention, but simply trying to preserve inner integrity when silence becomes impossible to maintain. When that happens, institutions often respond with subtle exclusion measures intended to preserve unity. That experience made me realize that loyalty is not only about following commands, but about maintaining honesty even when it brings disadvantage. A strong institution must be able to withstand the truth. Otherwise, it weakens itself by sacrificing the integrity of the very people who serve it. This is also what I observed in the Madeleine McCann case, where some investigators faced consequences not because they did anything wrong, but simply because they asked questions that did not align with the system's expectations. Prosecutors are expected to face risk, yet many within law enforcement fear their own superiors. We are trained to protect the vulnerable, but at times we struggle to protect information that causes inconvenience. The symbol of the profession is supposed to represent courage, but the system often maintains a culture of fear. I used to remind new recruits not to forget why they chose this work, but reality becomes more complicated as they advance and realize how easily their positions can be affected. The fact that investigators in Portugal were removed from the case, or that teams in Germany were restricted from speaking, sent a clear signal. Asking difficult questions can lead to career consequences. That signal results in many files not being reopened, many leads not being reviewed, and important information going unmentioned, not because no one knows, but because no one wants to take the risk. I do not believe the police force is decaying. The issue lies in the constraints created by fear, politics, and the need to maintain a unified appearance. A system does not need to control everyone. It only needs to convince them that doing the right thing will bring harm. This is what allows silence to dominate, while justice can only begin when there is enough courage to confront the truth. In many cases, the public often focuses on the archetype of the villain and the idealized figure, yet rarely asks the most important question: what happens if the truth does not align with the story we expect? This is a question that requires courage, and that courage is not always present. When discussing the Madeleine McCann case, I am not asking anyone to take sides. I am simply suggesting that they step away from the noise of the media, ignore the headlines, the immediate emotions, and the easy reactions, and focus instead on independent thought. Empathy without understanding provides only temporary comfort and brings no solution. When people confuse compassion with compliance, they stop asking questions, protect structures that do not deserve protection, and treat skepticism as ill intent. This is how injustices continue, not because of conspiracy, but because of deference. The goal is not to assign blame, but to pursue honesty, an honesty that does not depend on whom it may affect. If Madeleine McCann is to be remembered, it must be through the demand for verifiable evidence, not through the repetition of a media narrative. Justice is not established through social media trends or memorial rituals, but through information that can withstand a real investigative process. Justice does not emerge from polished declarations, but from the straightforward questions many people avoid. A journalist refusing to publish illogical information, or an investigator revisiting an old file and requesting further review. These small yet persistent actions form the foundation for seeking the truth, because they challenge the comfort of not knowing. In an interview, I once said that the truth does not disappear. It is only covered, like a candle shielded by a hand. The light does not go out. It simply waits for someone courageous enough to open the space for it to be seen again. That is the situation now. The truth still exists. It only needs someone willing to let it come to light. I have observed for many years how institutions repeat their mistakes because society allows it to happen. We witness, express emotion, and then move on, unintentionally sending the message that the system can continue its old behavior without consequence. If we want to break this cycle, we must do what the system often avoids: confront discomfort directly. Do not only feel compassion for the missing child. Look more broadly at a society that allowed her to disappear twice, once in presence and once in the pursuit of truth. I imagine a candle in a dark room, its faint light covered by many hands, the hands of officials, the media, politicians, and the public, all hesitant about what the light might reveal. But no hand can cover the light forever. A small movement is enough for it to escape. Truth works this way. It cannot be eliminated, only delayed. And perhaps that is the lesson of this case. Not about solving a mystery, but about the ethical demand required, prioritizing consequences over comfort, placing truth above reputation, and understanding that silence is not compassion, but passive consent. When asked whether justice will come, I always answer the same way: only when truth matters more than comfort. Until then, the case has no ending.